I'm calling this Courtney Brown and Dick Allgire, the ultimate conversation. How you doing, my friend Courtney Brown? You and I have been friends and colleagues and working together in remote viewing for about a quarter of a century.
No, I think it goes back farther than that. I think 2 or 3 centuries, Dick. It's been a long time.
You know what occurred to me, Courtney, was that in all the work we've done together, I don't recall a time that you and I have done a conversation like this where we have actually talked about remote viewing, talked about our work, because when I did so many projects with you for Farsight, I would work in isolation. So I would do my sessions here in Hawaii, send the video to you, you would edit it, and you would insert your part, and we never really did a back and forth about it. So here's a chance for us to have the ultimate conversation.
Actually, we should actually say that we never really had a chance to do a recorded back and forth, because you and I used to talk.
Oh yeah,
a lot.
you and I talk about. I'm sorry to interrupt. You and I talk about everything from politics to the end of the world, personal things, remote view, everything in private. But we just never got around to doing it on camera together.
Yeah, and I think people would like to hear what we talk about, or what we used to talk about all the time.
I want to go back to Farsight Institute and my training there in 1997. It was April of 97. Do you recall what you said in the graduation speech, your comments when, okay, you're trained as remote viewers, go out into the world? Do you remember what you told us?
I think I said something of, go ahead, you remind me better.
About some of you are going to take this and change the world. I'm paraphrasing you.
Yeah, I remember something like that. And I think that's correct. I don't think everyone was going to do that. I think a lot of people had done the remote viewing course for personal development. But I always knew that I never knew who, but I always knew that somebody was going to take the stuff and run with it and change the world. And I think you're a good example of one of the very, very few people that did that.
I was average in the class. I didn't stand out in the class, but I remember sitting there on that, I think it was a Saturday morning after we'd had that intense week, and you said, one or more of you are going to take this and you're going to do something fabulous and change the world. And that was a seminal moment in my life, Courtney, because we had just spent this week going across time and space, and for just an instant I saw myself in the future and I thought, this is going to be a really important part of my life. And it was.
Yeah, I remember very clearly, you were really deeply impressed by the entire thing, and you were committed to do something with it. And you also intermixed it with a lot of conversation at that time about stuff you loved, like guitar and things. So I knew you were taking the remote viewing experience and blending it in with other stuff in your life that you liked. So that was a good thing. And you also told me a lot about news, because you were a newscaster at that time. You were one of the faces of the news in the state of Hawaii at the time. And you were sort of, in your own mind, blending all of that together somehow. And I don't think you had a plan for how it would all blend, but you sort of had an idea that it would all blend. And in fact, that's what happened.
Tell us about the formation of the Farsight Institute. Okay, we go back to 96 or 97, Cosmic Voyage came out. I heard about you on Art Bell. Before I heard you as a guest, I heard Whitley Strieber talking to Art Bell about you, saying this famous professor at a well-known university, Dr. Courtney Brown, learned remote viewing, and he remote viewed Mars, and he's got this book out, and remote viewing is true and it validates the aliens. And I remember hearing that show going, oh, that's the most fascinating thing I've ever heard. I've got to get that book. I've got to learn about that. Then I heard you on the program, and I went there and you had it at the Holiday Inn, was it? Tell us about how you set all that up.
Yeah. I also, that was at the time when I was publicly, very clearly separating the stuff that I did at the university from the stuff that I did with Farsight. There were two separate tracks there, but not everybody made that distinction as clearly as I did. But I kept on emphasizing I don't do this stuff at the university. And yeah, I remember at that time clearly. I've never taken any money from Farsight personally. And so the book was doing pretty well. It was a bestseller in its day, Cosmic Voyage. And Cosmic Explorers, the sequel, sold pretty well as well. But I took every dime I had, all the money that I had, including all of the money that was coming in to Farsight as in terms of student tuitions, people who were paying to take the course. I just piled that all into growing the Institute, making it a place where people could learn. I was committed to the idea that there would be teachers, there would be instructors of remote viewing. So I wanted people to learn the procedures, but unlike a lot of other models where the person who's doing it continues to teach and then take all of the money, I wanted to take all the money and invest it in teachers. So I didn't take it for myself. And so there were teachers. You actually saw that. It was at the Holiday Inn, and we rented large rooms for the instruction, and we purchased dividers to separate people's tables so that they wouldn't see each other. And it was a big deal. We had multiple people helping with instruction. And it was the beginning of starting to spread things out. Farsight's changed a lot since then.
Yeah.
We now have a for-profit that's essentially a remote viewing movie business, and that funds everything right now. So, but back in those days where we were teaching and people were coming to take courses, people were paying tuitions, and again, I never took any of the money myself, but that's what we did. We taught, and you were probably the single most important result of that entire early time, other than the fact that I grew a lot from it. I mean, I learned a lot during that time period.
Well, I remember those days. It was an intense week, and you had those dividers up, and we'd have a lecture, and you'd give us a target. And we would all be with the padding on either side, scribble, 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 write, do the protocols, and then we'd all get together, and you had that long table spread out, and we'd all spread out everyone's session and go down the table and look at it. Oh wow, look at this, and then the next one. That was fun times. Jump ahead to, was it about 2010 that Daz and I began doing projects for you, and you were one of the first ones to say, hey, let's pay the remote viewers. You guys can get paid some money for doing projects. And Daz and I much appreciated that. You'd give us a target. And for those who don't know how that worked, I'm here in Hawaii, and Daz is over in Somerset in the UK. And Courtney would email us and say, we're ready to do a project. Are you guys ready? Yep. And he'd say, all right, this is project 15A, go. And that was all we were told. It's like, work 15A. So from that point on, there was no discussion about that, no communication with Daz. For me, Courtney, it was a rather lonely feeling because you'd give me work 15A, and I had no communication. I was all on my own. And I knew that you were going to make a DVD out of this, like a feature-length video. So the pressure was on, like, oh man, I hope and I have no idea. I'm just getting data that is seemingly to me unrelated, and I'm unsure of it. I send it in to you, and you go, that looks okay. Why don't you take it to whiteboard? And like, oh, okay, whatever. But thank you for paying us for that. It kept us going for a number of years, and it was the first model where you made quality remote viewing product and paid the viewers. It was a first.
That was a learning experience for all of us, especially me, because again, I didn't take any money for myself. I never used any money from the sale of the videos to buy groceries or pay rent or anything like that. So what I did was we would have these videos that we'd make, and then we'd sell them as standalone videos that we'd sell on Vimeo. And people used to buy them. And for 2 months, 3 months at the most, after the release of a video, a bunch of people would buy them, and I'd take all of the money and give it to you and Daz. And I also used some of it for paying some expenses that needed to be paid to make the videos, Vimeo fees and things like that. But there was always, and sometimes software, I had to use software. And back in those days, I was using Sony Vegas. Sony doesn't even do Vegas anymore. It still exists, but not as far as Sony. So but I had to buy software for it and stuff like that. But otherwise, it was all the money was just going to you and Jazz. And that was a big deal for me, because paying the remote viewers was the only way any of those projects could have happened. You had a job as a newscaster, but Daz definitely needed the extra income for that, and he wasn't going to devote as much time as was needed to do those projects. If you remember back in those days, those projects that we did it with sequential solo sessions. So you would do one session, and before we were done with the project, you would have done maybe 6, 7, 8, 9 sessions. So you would send in a session with paper, and you'd get so much. And then I'd say, oh, that's very interesting. Okay, look at page 7 that you've got. Tell me more about that. I'd send you an email saying, explore that. And then it went on and on and on like that. There was never any leading information, but whatever you gave me in your session, I'd say, expand more on that so that we could finally fill out the whole story. And you and Daz used to complain like anything. Yeah, it was like, so when is this thing going to be over?
we would get irritable because, for the most part, we never figured out what the target was. It'd be like, well, I saw this building that had a lot of hallways, and they had a lot of historical pictures, like the history of the place was important. And all of a sudden, there's something streaking over, and it gets hit by a missile. And then all right, tell me more about that. And what is it? Of course, that was 9/11. And
yeah, and you had to go back and do another session on that. And 9/11 was such a complicated thing because it had the whole Twin Towers thing plus the Pentagon thing. And each one had to have a whole bunch of sessions, all done blind without you knowing anything. And it was just very time consuming. We don't do it like that anymore at Farsight. We do... We have a what we call interview sessions. So what we have is, instead of having the single remote viewer go back over many months to look at a single target, it's still considered a solo session, but what happens is someone who's highly trained listens to the session while it's in progress, and then over Zoom gives a suggestion to continue on that page. Like, they'll come up with something exactly the same way we did it with the solo sessions, except that instead of waiting a week or two to start your next session, right then and there, the interviewer can say, okay, pursue that. And then they continue going. And so in a matter of 3 hours on a single session, you can get sort of the whole thing compact. That's the only way we can come out with this, with the quantity of stuff. But it was based on the model that you and Daz and I worked out. But we had to, and not everybody can do it. We don't consider that monitored session, because a monitor is someone who's teaching remote viewing and heavily leads the viewer. An interviewed session, it can be done only by a highly trained person who shuts up, who doesn't say anything, and only suggests things that are already reported. And normally we keep the audio off until we say, and they have to report something, they have to actually say something. And we also don't use paper anymore. We use iPads. I suppose you guys are similar. Maybe you guys still use paper. But I remember that you guys used to, but that process that we do now, the interviewed style, was based on the stuff that you and Daz did, which was you get so much, and then you tell the viewer to continue with that element on that page to have more. But that used to, without using the interviewed style, that took you months. I remember the 9/11 thing. What did that take? Was it like 3 months to complete that thing?
Yeah,
and you guys
it was a few months. One notable one I remember was Iapetus, and I was saying, this is a barren rock. Courtney, this is the most boring target you've ever given us. I just see a barren rock. And you said, well, keep looking. And so I'd do more. And then pretty soon I realized there's something in the face of a cliff, and there's this complex. So then I saw that, and then at one point I went into ERV, and Courtney, I saw Saturn from Iapetus. It filled the sky. It was the most, this was full experiential visual for me. It was eyes closed and the vision came of Saturn.
I remember.
But
I remember.
From Iapetus, and I realized, my God, they're using this as like a resort where people come to see this view. It's the most stunning view. And that turned out to be, from one of the seemingly most boring sessions I ever did for you, to one of the most interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that was done again with multiple sessions, because you said barren rock, and I said keep going. So it took you yet another session to do it. Yeah, sort of to add a little bit more to the style that we've developed now with the interviewed stuff. We shut the video off so that the person doing the session cannot see the interviewer, and we shut the audio off so the person doing the session can't hear anything from so they're doing the session solo, except that at the end of when they run out of steam and they just don't know what else to do. Like when you do your barren rock thing, then we'd click the audio back on, only the audio, and say, pursue that, and click off the audio again. But that whole stuff that we do now was all based on what you and Daz did. And that Iapetus target was really, really, really interesting, because, Dick, we had a really good photograph of that facility on Iapetus. And I knew that you guys just needed to look at it longer, and you'll eventually see it. You did. Daz had the same experience, by the way. Daz had the same experience. He was really upset with me at first because I sent him to a target that had barren rock. He had the same experience.
Your presentation style now is so amazing. I assume you designed that. How difficult is the lighting when you have the viewer writing? And do you have to reverse that image? What's the technology, without giving away your secrets, where they're writing on a board and it's...
Yeah, we don't have secrets, so you can ask me anything. No, we invested $6,000 in a piece of optical glass, and it's called a light board. And again, I've still never taken any money from Farsight, so the money that we were getting, we were just reinvesting. And that light board, we didn't like the whiteboard, and the reason is I knew that we had to change the planet with this, just the same way you knew you were going to change the planet. And writing on a whiteboard for us was just not going to do it. It just wasn't entertaining enough. It wasn't sci-fi enough. It wasn't cool enough. So one of our audience actually put a note in our forums and said, on our YouTube discussion area, and said, why don't you use a light board? And I read the comment and I said, what? What's that? And it turned out there were two companies making light boards. And one of them was a professor of physics, and that was just his thing that he sort of designed. He invented one that was really great. And what that is normally when you take a piece of glass and you look at it sideways, like on the edge, it's green. Now the green color is because there's iron in the glass. And to get the green color out, you have to have all the iron removed. So that's how you can make optical glass. So we have a 6 foot by 6 foot, no, it's a 4 foot by 6 foot piece of optical glass that's on a stand on top of a table. And it has lights that shine towards the viewer when the viewer is in front of it to light up the viewer. But it also has lights around the entire edge that shine into the glass. And that light cannot escape from the glass unless a marker marks on the glass. And we have a black background behind it. So we turn off all the lights in the studio, and the person has the light on themselves and nothing in the background, no light on the background. So when they're writing on the light board, the light that's trapped inside the glass can escape. And so it looks like they're writing on air. Now, when we edit the video, I then flip it horizontally so people can read it, because when we record it, it's backwards, of course. But when we do a live stream, I have another device that flips the video live, and so that when they're doing a live stream and they're writing, it looks flipped because it's just another piece of tech. It goes in between everything else, but we don't do that when we're recording a light board session.
Well, it looks really cool. It's great. So, Courtney, you've always told me for many, many years that two things needed to happen. One, UFO disclosure needs to be acknowledged, and two, remote viewing needs to be acknowledged, and then the world will be changed. And you've always felt that that's what we're doing. That's what Farsight's doing. That's what we're doing at Future Forecasting, is laying down this record. Where do you think we are in disclosure? Obviously we're in a kind of a controlled release. Do you think there's going to be what they call catastrophic disclosure, where all at once it's all admitted? What do you think's happening with UFO reality on disclosure?
Okay, there's two things that I have to mention. There are only two venues that exist that I know of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, where there are full public projects available for people to watch. And that's your stuff that you're doing with Daz and others, Ed Riordan and others.
We just now changed it and rebranded it from CryptoViewing to Future Forecasting. So it's futureforecastinggroup.com.
Yeah, and so there's that, and then there's Farsight. So that's it. And so if you look at like the entire the rest of the remote viewers out there, or people who work in remote viewing, they're enjoying it. It's like a hobby. It's fun, but like nothing's happening in terms of actual projects. So your group and Farsight are it. And so in terms of things happening, the connection between remote viewing and the UFO ET thing and changing the world, it's just Farsight and you guys. You know, it's a big deal. Now, the thing about remote viewing is I knew intuitively that they would have to be linked because we kept bumping into ETs all over the place. Now, I also knew that we couldn't do, and you and Daz used to harp on this all the time, that we couldn't do just UFO ET targets because it would be too much woo-woo stuff, and people would disregard remote viewing because they couldn't accept the idea of there being extraterrestrials or UFOs, which are now called UAPs. So, yeah, so we always had to blend stuff in. Mostly it was political stuff, the JFK assassination, the 9/11 stuff, and basically everything else that we did, the Cydonia Mars, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Iapetus project, they always had huge elements of verifiable stuff. We had astronomical pictures and things that were part of the target. You had to see what we're seeing in the picture. And that was and also the base on Mars, if you remember, where the nozzle came out and the stuff was spewing out there. You were the first viewer to describe that really clearly. You had the nozzle coming out of a dome and then it was spraying stuff. It was an incredible session. So, and that was as clear as day in the picture. So we kept on bumping into these things. And so it became evident that you can't really promote remote viewing without talking about the extraterrestrial content. And if you're going to accept the reality of remote viewing, the first thing that's going to be asked is, well, what did you guys see? And we see not only the political stuff, but we see the alien stuff, the UFO stuff. And then it became clear that the aliens had this capability of a remote perception as sort of normal for them. And so we just sort of had that sort of build. But yeah, I always knew that there would be a disclosure moment. There's an issue, Dick. I actually want to talk to you about this one thing. You're right. I actually mentioned on the Chris Lido show, his Lido Files show, that what we're heading towards is catastrophic disclosure, just like you mentioned. And that's where the disclosure comes out all at once, as compared with dribbling it out. Now, if it comes dribbling out over 100 years or 20 years or 10 years, it can be controlled and it's going to be all messed up. But catastrophic disclosure simply means that it all comes out all at once. And that looks like what we're heading towards. So when that happens, it really looks like it's going to be happening sooner rather than later. Like, for example, you and I were talking before this recording about the fact that Joe McMonagle has an interview coming out with Sean Ryan, which that's a big deal. I mean, that type of exposure is on that level on the Sean Ryan show is a big deal. And it looks like that the remote viewing stuff, which has also been mentioned on the Joe Rogan, other venues, it's going to be hitting prime time. And when you actually talk about it, you know, you can introduce yourself to people only once. So we have to be ready. But when it happens, when the catastrophic disclosure happens, the real question is going to be, it's catastrophic also implies a mess, meaning it's going to be a lot of stuff. And I'm sort of wondering about yourself, I think you're probably pretty safe, because talk about the paparazzi or whatever, people just get wild and crazy. I think you're pretty safe out there in Hawaii. But the issue is security. I just wondered if you're planning on doing anything extra with security. Now, definitely don't mention what you're planning or anything on the video. But are you even thinking about that step?
Well, I've been thinking more in terms of social disruption from a number of causes. So yeah, I plan on taking precautions. Like, people can find me pretty easy, and pretty soon it won't be as easy to find me. But if catastrophic disclosure comes, it's going to upend everything. Like, normal people who haven't been following this, their reality is going to be so tilted on its head, they won't know what to do.
And you're going to have been a prime mover and shaker in this. So it's not just me and Farsight, you and Daz and everybody you've got out there with your group. It's a big deal, Dick, and it's gonna upend everything. But it needs to happen that way. It can't happen slow. If it happens slow, it's going to be controlled, and the planet will not benefit. It has to happen quickly, because that's the only way it can be uncontrolled, so that the information comes out suddenly, and then the powers that be can't control what they want people to know and what they don't want people to know.
So you see that happening pretty soon?
It has to happen pretty soon. It's gotten to the point where it's inevitable. You can't hide it back. And the idea, I think, that the sort of powers that be have, that they can control it continually, it's like putting your finger in the hole of a dam, and the dam is cracking. Eventually the dam's just going to fall apart. And the government itself is split. I'm absolutely firmly convinced that the military, for example, is totally split. I think half of the military definitely wants disclosure to happen, catastrophic disclosure, and the other half is desperately trying to prevent it. And the government, I think, really doesn't know what it's talking about. And so there's an inevitability to it at some point. You can't prevent the catastrophic disclosure forever. And the mainstream media, they're going to be caught with their pants down entirely because they've been feeding people junk for decades that's simply untrue. And when the catastrophic disclosure happens, it's going to be quite obvious that the evidence for that junk has been in front of people's faces, and any intelligent person should have been able to look at the evidence and say what the government was saying was happening wasn't happening. And then the mainstream media is going to really suffer. And then what you're going to have is, what you're seeing already, is that the main sources of the media, the major networks and things like that, they're going to become less and less important. And then there's going to be greater importance for podcasts and independent broadcasters. So anyway, that's inevitable. I still think there's going to be a scandal. I think the government's last stand to try to control things.
What kind of in what sense a scandal?
I think that they've probably got a lot of data, a lot of information on things that people have done in the past that they shouldn't have done, probably illegal things, and they have monitored all types of things. Lots of people do things that they shouldn't have done, and I think they have a sort of a full-blown picture of what looks like the entire industry, the UFO, the ET, perhaps even the remote viewing side of things, that a whole big chunk of that has got some compromising information. And I think they're going to come out with that suddenly. And that will be the main signal that the main disclosure, the sort of catastrophic disclosure, is going to hit soon, because they're only going to do that. You can only pop that balloon once. So I think they're going to do that in an attempt to sort of knock out a lot of the people that would seize the attention. For example, Dick, when you see the disclosure that's coming out in the U.S. Congress these days with the David Grush hearings and so on, you get a lot of people showing up in the mainstream news that never had access to the mainstream news before. A lot of people in the UFO field are suddenly out there and being presented as authorities in this whole area. And they were never addressed as authorities before that. Well, if catastrophic disclosure happens and those people are still doing their thing, they will become the authorities. And then the government and the mainstream, whatever, they're not going to be the authorities. And the mainstream and the government will just simply lose their audience, and you'll get the collapse. What you had is the collapse of the former Soviet Union that happened like that. There was no revolution that occurred. There was no people in the streets. There was no military intervention. The Soviet Union just became irrelevant, and people walked away. So I think the last thing the government's going to try to do is to prevent that from happening. So I think a big scandal is in the works, meaning all the pieces are probably set and there, and they're waiting for it to happen. But they're not going to do it until they need to do it. And that's going to be an attempt to sort of control the alternate sources of information that are coming out to a limited few. That's what I think is going to happen.
Do you think the powers that be are ever going to admit the true potential of remote viewing? Because they've always downplayed what we do. Do you think that will be forced on them by, okay, the truth of UFO aliens comes out, and then they go back and look at all the data we've been putting out for all these years, and we'll be able to verify that. There will be researchers looking into things on the moon, civilization on Mars, Cydonia, Roswell, Phoenix Lights, all these things we've done. You're expecting we'll get some good validation on that, and that will validate remote viewing.
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. That's going to happen because the facts are the facts, and once people go out and investigate the facts, the remote viewing will be verified. So the complaint that was made early on was that some of the stuff that we got was unverifiable. But always with all projects that you and I have been involved with from the very beginning, there was always a huge verifiable component, like the Great Pyramid of Giza. you've got the Great Pyramid of Giza. I mean, it's staring right in your face. I mean, it's big. It's a huge pyramid, and they have other pyramids right next door. So when you and Daz had to describe the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, you had to describe a desert environment with these huge periods in a nice formation. So it was that's the verifiable stuff. And then the new stuff was added, which is how the pyramids were actually being constructed. But the verifiable components were absolutely, perfect and huge. And so what's going to happen is that people will eventually realize that the stuff that we've been doing is not unverifiable. It always had something huge that's verifiable, and then it had the new stuff, and then the new stuff can become verified as authorities, investigate further. So, like, even if you look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, they can't move those blocks now, today. Some of those are 80-ton blocks, and some other large archaeological sites, the blocks are even bigger, a lot bigger. And there's no way people know how to move those things now. And the way they were cut, and you described in your session exactly the way they were cut. They were cut perfectly. You can't even stick a human hair between those blocks when they're set in place. You can't do that with camels and people running around in loincloths. You just can't do it. They can't even do it now with modern machinery. So, the theories that the mainstream comes up with in order to say that this is how it was done, it's just laughable. And so when the remote viewing stuff is finally acknowledged, then it's going to be that catastrophic sort of awakening, like, okay. See, it's because they refuse to acknowledge that ETs could exist or that UFOs exist that they cannot get to the conclusion of how the Great Pyramids of Giza were actually constructed. That had to use ET tech. And because they don't accept that ETs are even possible, then they can say, well, then we're just doing crazy stuff, when in fact their theories are the crazy stuff. So that's going to lead to a huge industry of verification of remote viewing stuff. And people are going to see that the remote viewing stuff was a heck of a lot more accurate than a bunch of archaeologists or historians running around and sort of trying to come up with crazy stories to justify impossible acts.
Mainstream archaeology is a complete joke. I mean, they ignore most of the real evidence.
Well, they make a lot of effort to avoid the obvious. And I mean, I was, my son was out in an archaeological dig with some mainstream, in a mainstream setting. And I won't mention the place or the setting, but he talked to the graduate students that were there, and he raised the issue of, what do you think about these things? Like Michael Cremo wrote a whole book on forbidden archaeology, and he said, well, what do you think about that, that stuff? And the graduate students uniformly, absolutely every one of them, and they were graduate students in huge universities, big universities, they said, oh, we can't talk about that. We can't even whisper anything about that. Otherwise we'll be kicked out of the program. We won't be able to get a job. Our careers will be ruined. So that we just have to stick to what they allow us to talk about. And it was not like hidden that they had limits to what they were able to think about or talk about. It was very open. They understood that there were limits. And so, it's all going to collapse one day. And when it does collapse, it'll have to be sudden, Dick. Once you start the process of disclosure, how can you slow it down? It's like when a dam breaks and the water sort of floods out. How can you slow down the water? Once it's broken and it's rushing down the valley, it's over. You just have to wait till the water goes down the valley.
Speaking of these young kids, here's my view, Courtney, is that we had Generation X, we had the Millennials, and we had Gen Z. And Gen Z, you've run out of alphabet. That's the last generation of the present civilization. And the children that are born now in January, starting January 2024, are going to be called Generation Alpha. And they're going to grow up in a much different world where we have amazing technology, where we have realization of our true consciousness, that we can remote view and that we're all psychic, and we'll have open interaction with ET. How do you like all that?
And my own personal view is that this is a war going on right now, and a big struggle. So it's not guaranteed that that's what will happen. But it looks like there's a good possibility that that will happen. I think the future is going to be determined by clearly what we're doing now. But how it's actually going to pan out is going to be something I'm going to be interested in seeing.
I hit you with all the good news, scientific, amazing technology, remote viewing, ET. The bad news, in my view, is that the administrators of this place have decided that nation states have outlived their usefulness, that they don't need nation states as an accounting tool, and the accounting of humanity will be done on distributed ledger blockchain using the technological advances. So the children today are going to be more of along the lines of a cellular automaton in a pretty much virtual world, with the accounting of their life force being done on blockchain. That's a little more bleak than some people would care to consider.
Yeah, I think that's to be determined. I don't think that's set in stone. I do think that there are forces at play in our current reality that are trying to do that. So I think that's a correct sort of analysis of what those forces want to do and are going to do everything they can to make it happen.
Who would those forces be? I'd ask you, who runs the world?
But in terms of who the major players are, you can't see them. The major players that you see, which is a president of the United States or prime ministers, those people are not relevant to any of this. They are people that are managed, that are controlled.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Now the big players are smart enough to keep themselves hidden. They precisely don't want the masses to know who they are. I mean, that's exactly the whole point. Now, there's some major economic people who are, incredibly rich, that people sometimes look at and say, well, that must be one of the major players. But the reality, the real movers and shakers, the real controllers, the people that are trying to, quite frankly, are trying to prevent catastrophic disclosure, those players you don't really see. And
they've been hidden for thousands of years. They've been hidden throughout humanity's time here.
And they definitely want to keep it that way. They definitely do not want people to know that they even exist. In fact, they'd love to have it so that it's resigned to the element of what they call conspiracy theory. So anytime you say something about something that they don't like, they call it a conspiracy theory.
That's one of the great psychological warfare coups in history, was that label. Whoever came up with that, it was brilliant. But it's, 2 words and they just shut you down.
Yeah, they had to come up with a justification for the John F. Kennedy assassination. That was very clearly not the work of one shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald. It had to be multiple shooters, and the shooters that did it were sharpshooters. They were really good, and they had the evidence for that was overwhelming. Even in the Warren report, when they came out with that, the gun that they said Lee Harvey Oswald used to assassinate Kennedy, it was old and rusted, and the sights on it could not be fixed. They had sights on it, and the forensic people of the U.S. government tried to fix the sights with shims in order to get them to line up, and they couldn't do it. It was that badly broken. And you can't shoot the president from that far away with a gun that was like that. And in addition, anybody who did shoot the president had to have been an expert marksman. And if there's one thing you know about gun owners, is they take care of their guns. They clean their guns, they polish their guns, they're always in perfect working order. And it's impossible for sharpshooters to have done what they did and to be using a rusted gun that didn't have sights that were lined up.
Especially a Marine. Marines are taught. Marines get big trouble if they don't keep their weapons in ship shape.
Anyone who's a sharpshooter, it's a requirement. They have to do it correct. Now the thing is, they had to come up with a way to turn the media away from that entire thing. So that conspiracy theory, those two words, was just perfect. They get everybody to say, if you look at the evidence here, we're going to call you a conspiracy theory person, a conspiracy theorist, and everyone's going to laugh at you. The power of potential ridicule is so powerful. They got the entire media, and they even had academics. They had a few academics I used to watch on the television news that were just sort of amazing to me. They had a couple academics sort of investigate the whole thing. I don't know what they paid those guys, but I remember one guy on television saying, "Oh no, this is entirely true." Because you could see Kennedy's head being hit from the front and then being hit from the back, and so you could see his head going back and forth, and then the brains sort of spilled out to the back. So the gun that they said Lee Harvey Oswald used shot from behind, yet the brains were spilling out in the opposite direction. And so the reporter said, well, how could that possibly be? It's ludicrous. And so they said, how could that possibly be? And the reporter, and the academic who they were actually interviewing said, oh no, it's very clear. You see, there's a whiplash action with the muscles. You hit the brain from one side, you hit the head from one side, but the muscles, they react, they spasm, and then they throw the brains out in the opposite direction, in the direction of where the bullet came from. What Hollywood movie producer were they working for? That was crazy. Yeah. And so the evidence was overwhelming with the filming that actually happened of the assassination, that it wasn't what they said it was, and so they came up with a word, conspiracy theory, and it really was powerful, and fear of ridicule worked.
You can't find. There used to be 9/11 videos on YouTube, like pilots for 9/11 Truth, architects and engineer for 9/11 Truth. Those are hidden now. Those are really hard to find. They're suppressed.
Yeah, they had thousands of pilots sign on and sign petitions, and saying that what was actually reported and happening in 9/11 couldn't have happened. So and you also had people that were looking at the Twin Towers, and some of them were extremely respectable. Literally thousands of architects and engineers were signing petitions and saying, it couldn't happen that way. You can't have the Twin Towers collapse like that. And then when they really were focusing on it, they would look at the Building 7, which was next to the Twin Towers. That was a really solid building. And that was not hit by a jet, yet it collapsed. And anybody who does anything with demolition could see that it was controlled demolition. And the engineers and architects were saying there is no way an office furniture fire with a little jet fuel could have done that to that building. Suddenly complete collapsed the entire thing. So those charges that had to have been placed in that building had to have been placed, days or maybe weeks ahead of time.
Daz Smith described that perfectly. And there were people that worked in the building that testified. They've been saying, yeah, they were doing a retrofit, or the floor below us, they closed the whole floor, and then we could hear workmen drilling and putting things in.
The amount of deception, the amount of lying, the amount of manipulation that has been throughout modern history is to control the populace has been absolutely mind-boggling. But ultimately, we're just going back to the facts. We're just going back to look at what actually happens, and so when we get catastrophic disclosure, then people will look at the remote viewing evidence, and then they will follow the breadcrumbs and get the rest. it's the biggest trouble with the 9/11 is for the authorities to depend on the media and the public to say, no, they couldn't have done that. They could not have done that. That's what they're depending on. They're depending on people to say, no, they can't have done that. Because as long as they can get people to say, no, they can't have done that, then you're giving permission for them to do exactly that. What they got out of the 9/11 thing was 2 wars.
Well, they got more than that, more than just wars, Courtney. What they got was people accepting a surveillance state, people accepting having to show their papers, to show their identity, and the people that run the world, they're thinking decades in advance. So they had 9/11 to look at where we're going today with a digital ID and people accepting the level of surveillance and requirements for identification.
I personally don't mind that because I think that's inevitable. It's going to happen anyway. But that's the event that they use to jumpstart that, to get it to happen. It's inevitable that people's lives are going to be watched because it's inevitable that things will be digital. And the more things are digital, the more people are going to be looked at, the more people are going to be watched. The only way you're going to be able to truly protect yourself from that is to be like an African guy that I heard of. I read about him in the newspaper in Africa, where he climbed up a tree and with a bunch of rocks, and he just threw rocks at anyone who came by. So
that's about what you need to do. Yeah. I was someone who didn't like the move away from cash. Like, I'll never give up cash. I'll never present my ID. I'll never use my thumbprint to get into the fitness center. And what they're doing now with the number of passwords and logins and 2-factor authentication, they're making your life so miserable to do anything that you will acquiesce. If they say, 1 digital ID, sign up once, that's your ID, that'll get you on to your crypto wallet, to Facebook, to email, to any, anywhere you need to go, travel. People will accept that in a heartbeat. Go, sure, scan my face. Well, people have already scanned their faces. People are already in the system. So it's step by step, a slice at a time.
I personally think that anonymity is over. So how it's used is different from whether anonymity actually does cease to exist. And remember, from my perspective, I'm not talking about telling people how to govern themselves. I'm not talking about having a certain form of government or in any way, shape, or form. The only thing we've been saying from the very beginning is tell people the truth. And then let the cards fall the way they fall. Just let everything happen. Just tell people the truth. Right now, they're in the big UFO disclosure problem, where they're really trying to just say that UFOs exist, UAPs or UFOs exist. But the mainstream is still focusing on, does that mean we're not alone in the universe? I mean, it's so stupid. How stupid can you get? We're not alone in the universe. Of course we're not alone in the universe. The real question is, what have the ETs have been doing all of these thousands of years? And no one's asking that question.
Well, the bigger question is, did they alter our DNA and create us? And why?
Well, that's a good question. That's a very good question, because there's been punctuated change in the human species at certain time periods. So the mainstream idea is that we popped out of apes 100,000 years ago or so, and then here we are, and like, that's impossible. So it seems clear that new strains of human beings have been introduced to this planet, because evolution happens. I mean, Darwin's correct. There is such a thing as evolution, but it takes millions and hundreds of millions of years for any significant change to occur. It doesn't happen in 100,000 years. So you can't just say Cro-Magnons beat the Neanderthals. What you really had is new strains of humanity being introduced, and that had different capabilities. And once you once you accept that there has been this punctuated change, you say, well, then who's doing it? And then the punctuated change becomes a question of, well, what did they have in mind? What did they want to do? And I think one of the things that people are going to eventually discover is that there's been a lot written into the DNA. It's not just it's not just natural selection. There's been a lot. And I think one of the problems we're having with disclosure is that I think part of the stuff that's been written into the DNA is a resistance to certain ideas. Now, this is something that's in political science, so I can talk about this with some authority here, that they have discovered through examining twins, not just 10 or 15, but thousands of twins that have been separated at birth and then raised in entirely different environments. So the old idea of were they raised by a liberal family or a conservative family, it could be controlled because the twins were separated at birth and they didn't communicate with one another and they were just in separate realms. And the studies have come out that are really quite authoritative, that it doesn't matter what family you were raised by, because the twins, when you follow them when you actually go into the governmental records, find out who they are, and then locate them again, and you're talking tens of thousands of people, then they ask them, what are their politics? And they're identical. So the twins, it doesn't matter what kind of family they grew up in, they're both conservative or they're both liberal, their political ideology is somehow genetically embedded. And it's really not in dispute in political science anymore that happens. So that it's clear that genes can convey ways of thinking. So if you're an advanced extraterrestrial race and you're going to be introducing a new species of humanity onto the planet, that's open game. Well, let's see what they can do. So I think the resistance to these types of new ideas is probably genetically built in. And I think also the UFO disclosure issue is partially genetically built in as well. Otherwise, it'd be hard to, given the amount of content, the amount of UFO disclosure information that's out there, it's really hard to figure out how 8 billion people could continue to keep their heads in the sand. So it looks like the genetics is set up to have it work out that way. Otherwise, keeping everybody sort of dumbed down would it would be impossible unless there was some type of genetic underpinning towards it. Now, I don't have any way to prove that, but since we do know about the issue with twins and party and political ideology, then it makes sense that an advanced species that would be intervening and changing humanity along the way, they would try to control the species in certain ways, and fiddling with the genes in that way seems perfectly okay. They probably also fiddled with the genes to make remote viewing and telepathy more difficult automatically, so that people don't automatically just do this. Otherwise, people would figure out that the whole setup is a ruse right away.
Well, I've sometimes wondered if maybe we aren't supposed to remote view, that as part of our experience in this physical body was to experience it only on this dimension with this getting input from our physical reality, and that's a leakage, and it's like we're not supposed to be able to do that. Sometimes I wonder that. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's part of the. I personally, this is belief now, I personally think that's built into the genes. I think that's what's going on. I think once the geneticists dig into this deep enough, that's what they will find. So
we've outsmarted the game. We outsmarted the system by remote viewing.
But wait a second, there probably had to be some genetic predisposition in you and me and Daz and the other remote viewers we're working with to get them to do this in the first place. So it probably wasn't a perfect genetic fix. it probably was imperfect. Otherwise, you and I wouldn't be here.
Well, my view on that is that the DNA is an assembly machine that was created by the ETs. So DNA is this machine that takes the elements from the earth and can create a earth suit, a body suit, a meat suit for our souls to come in and have this experience. And that some of our souls come here with a mission, with a plan, with things that they need to do.
That's going to be a little bit of a difference of opinion for us, you and I here, because at Farsight we've gone into this a lot, and we've come to the conclusion that this is a prison, and that the souls don't escape. We don't even call them souls anymore, we call them isbis, someone who is for the purpose of being. And since it is possible to remote view across time and space anywhere, anytime, any space, obviously our ISB parts exist across time and space. So it's impossible to kill an ISB because we exist everywhere. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to see all those things in remote viewing. So the ISBs can't be killed, but they can be controlled, they can be enslaved, they can be manipulated. And everything that we have looked at, and we have a huge number of projects that seem to be pointing in the exact same direction, especially where we've explicitly looked at this exact question, is that people don't come here voluntarily. They're thrown in here, this is a prison, and they can't get out. Death used to be a form of transportation, but that's not the way it is here at this spot. So that's where, but you and I are going to differ on that, but that's okay.
Well, we're not that different. My view is that, my understanding is that we're not gods. We didn't create this. We didn't create the body. We didn't create our soul. We didn't put our soul here. Some higher power did that. Somebody with more intelligence and more technology than we have. So I don't call it a prison, but I don't agree with people who say, "Oh, I'm this spiritual being. I chose to be here, and I have the powers of a god." Well, this will be controversial.
We're always controversial, Dick. Go ahead.
I think there are human beings on this earth that are just like place markers. They're just here as props. People that don't really have a purpose, that aren't really furthering the experience for those that have a real mission. Now, on the other hand, I heard of one lady had a near-death experience, and during her near-death experience, Spirit was explaining what happened, and said, "Look, every human has value," and she said, "Look at that beggar, that drunk that's laying in the gutter. I mean, what's their value?" And the Spirit showed her that person incarnated rather, and lived that horrid life as a drunken, wretched person, just to let one other soul experience compassion.
This is going to be one of the areas where you and I probably disagree, because what we have done in our Farsight projects, and we've burrowed into this a lot, the death experience starts with someone seeing the light, and the light is actually this is just something that's come out of our projects. The light is actually a very strong wave that pulls the ISB in. And then once they get in, it's like a trap. The more they struggle against it, the more it gets sticky and they can't get out. And then they're zapped with an extremely high voltage something or other that rattles them. And that gets rid of their memories, it gets rid of their telepathy, remote viewing capabilities. They're just empty shells. And then an AI comes in. And artificial intelligence is all computerized and feeds in a whole bunch of memories. And then the AI inevitably says, "Oh, and by the way, we've discussed your case with the Council of Elders. You see the Council of Elders over there? And we think that those few things you need to work on in your personality like the arguments you used to have with your mother and your son and your daughter is having this problem. We think you should go back and work on a few of these things. Now, with no memories or anything, the person inevitably says, "You're right, I need to do that. Let me go back." And so it's a way to sort of recycle people back in. So the story that you just came up with is a perfect example of a type of story that could be told to someone that they're here to learn lessons. But the reality is you exist throughout time and space. That means you've existed. Nobody exists on the planet Earth that hasn't been around for like millions and millions and millions and millions of years. So you don't need to be born back in this place to learn a new lesson. I mean, that whole idea of coming back here to learn a new lesson, that's all prison control propaganda that comes out of these AIs. And then people get born back here and they get recycled and no one gets out. So that's what we have concluded.
So what are you going to do to break that? Are you going to not go to the light when you pass on?
Yeah, you can't go to the light when you get out. You got to get out. And we've been investigating this a lot.
John Lear brought that up. The UFO investigator that passed away not too long ago. He said it's a don't go to the light. It's a trap.
Yeah, the light is a trap. It's the thing that sucks you in. But it's actually a lot more complicated. We have a lot of projects that sort of have focused on this. We have one project called the death traps. That's what we call that whole thing of the light and the electrocution and the whole thing. But this place is being operated as a prison, and it's an extremely valuable resource to a group of extraterrestrials that need all of these ISBs, all of these people in the future. Just imagine, you can't do anything in the galaxy without an ISB animating it. So if you're to expand in the galaxy and have a wartime expansion, you need a bunch of ISBs, millions and billions of them. And this is like an incredible resource. So you have to control them in order to manipulate them to do what they want. And in the future, they're going to need them for everything, for tradespeople, for military resources, mercenaries, prostitutes that are used to service those military people. It's just they're going to need a whole thing, and they're going to have to all march together with sort of a fascist orientation, a totalitarian orientation towards expansion of their system. And the Earth prison system that contains all these people is extremely valuable as a resource, and that's why they're fighting to keep it. That's what we have concluded at Farsight, and that you and I and Daz and the others that we work with were anomalies, and we run the risk of collapsing the entire system, because the system is a psychological prison. It's not a system it's not a prison based on bars, cement and bars and big buildings. It's a psychological prison. So once you get catastrophic disclosure, literally the entire prison falls apart. And that's why there is such a fierce fight to prevent disclosure, because the whole house of cards will collapse. And it's more than just the current Earth governments that are going to have to answer for what's been going on, and the current media is going to have to answer for what's going on. Literally, the controllers, the extraterrestrial controllers that run this place as a prison, they're going to lose control. Everything comes apart. And that's the only way to help humanity. The prison authorities have to be kicked out. That's the only way humans can get out of this place. And that's really that's the evolution of Farsight since the days when you and Daz were working here.
What the ladies that you're training that are working with you, they started out with a trajectory that probably didn't include achieving cosmic consciousness. When you teach them to remote view, how do they react? What's their...
Well, they're not just ladies. There's also my son, and there's also Rock Archie, who you know. But my son also Aziz, and we're planning on training other people. But for them to do any projects, they have to work with us for about a year, almost full time, doing stuff before they're good enough to do this. So the issue is with them is they have to be trained to the level where they can do this, where they can recognize these perceptions and isolate them from physical, visual imagery and mental remembered imagery. And that's basically it. They have to be able to do that on demand.
But my question was, when they do that, what's their reaction? What do they say to you? Like, oh my God, Courtney.
No, their first thing is this is the best job they've ever had, because they don't have to wait tables. They don't have to be a slave
I feel
in a
the same
corporate
way.
system.
This is the best job I ever had. It's even more interesting than being a reporter. So being a remote viewer is a great job.
But you asked me what's their first reaction. So that's their first reaction. You mean I get paid to do this? And then the second reaction is, so if this is like real, is this for real? And so they then start asking questions, and they become, it's incremental. It's incremental, Dick. It's not like suddenly they're Buddhas. It's incremental. Then they suddenly start pulling everything together. And then when people see them, that's very interesting. When people see them, they ask them questions, and they don't even recognize, they don't even know that they're celebrities. They don't even know that when they get to a conference, everyone wants to talk to them. They don't know how well known they are, because they're in a Farsight bubble. They do their work solo in their houses. They don't even come to a single studio to do it and talk to each other. They do their work by themselves in their houses, in their solo. And then they come here to the studio, again solo, and they're here. I'm in the studio now. They come to the studio, and I or Aziz, we set up all the camera work, and then we leave. So we're not here when they actually do their recording. So we have to train them to use the light board and to to do absolutely everything. And then they call us when they're done. Then we come in and we turn off the cameras and we take everything. So, then inevitably the questions start being raised. And we have meetings together where we talk about these things. I want to say one other thing, Dick. We also have gotten to the point where by themselves they have started to have meetings. And they have meetings or monthly meetings where they gather together, where they realize that remote viewing is just the tip of the iceberg. They're interested in all types of mental stuff now. So this has never been exposed to the public before. This will be new for everybody. But they have monthly meetings where they work on lottery experiments, lots of lottery experiments, and they're good with the lottery experiments. They have been focusing on what they call here in Georgia, they call it the cash pop or something like that, where it's one number. You have to predict one number, and they're good. They have earned a lot more money than they've spent on tickets, so they're not like running out of money to do this. So cash pop is easier because it has like one number they're trying to get. But they're also working on stuff to perceive people that you can't see, like invisible people, ghosts and things like that. They're working on that. They're also working on movement, so sort of telekinesis. Moving things, you might call them, they sometimes call them Jedi powers or Goku powers or various names they call them. But they did this on their own, Dick. They didn't do that because I organized it.
There's that moment for all remote viewers, the first time, where you unambiguously describe a target and you get the feedback, and there's that oh my God moment, and that opens you up for so much more. I mean, the possibilities become limitless.
Yeah, and they do that themselves. So that answers your question. When did they start? They got to the point where they weren't just asking me for answers. They were making their own meetings and assembling. And the meetings aren't just like gatherings where they just talk openly. They have an actual structure for the meeting. They have a set number of things they're going to be doing, and a whole bunch of stuff they do. They go one thing after the next, like a class. And then they all try things and they all contribute, and it's fascinating stuff. You might consider it like a Jedi school where but they're going beyond remote viewing. And that was done by them. So that's the answer to your question. They have taken it, they are currently taking it to the next level.
I got to ask you one question that it'll sound impertinent, but I'm not being disrespectful. But I've got to ask you
it's
this.
Great. Yeah, please.
Do you honestly believe you're talking telepathically to an invisible alien?
Oh yeah, we did a whole project on that called The Reality of Harvey. And we did a whole project where we sent all of our remote viewers, totally blind, the same as all of our other projects, to look at one of those meetings. And they absolutely, every single one, it's on farsightprime.com, they absolutely, every one of them came back with the exact information. They had 2 guys sitting on the beach, a ton of security people all over the place, an ET ship, actually more than one ET ship around, and these 2 guys were talking, and they all said they couldn't figure out why these 2 guys were talking alone on the beach. And the only thing that was sort of interesting is that they didn't see Harvey as invisible. They saw him as there, and sort of the way I see it. So, Dick, look at it this way. When you go to a target and you see some people, you often see people with your remote viewing eye.
Yeah.
And you it gets projected onto your cells in the brain and so on like that. Eventually you become good enough at doing that beings that are out of phase with us and you are sort of invisible, you can see them just as easily as you can see anybody else. And eventually it becomes natural for you to be able to see them. And then when you go into a session, Dick, I can't tell you the number of times you wrote on your sessions how you were getting information directly from the person. When you did the Phoenix-like stuff, you had conversations with the person in the ship, and the person was telling you stuff in the ship, and you were writing it all down.
Yeah. The navigation system, the
whole thing.
Yeah.
So you've had that exact experience. Well, once you trust that stuff, then it can happen naturally. And with me, I have been doing this from the very beginning. I really focused a lot on that type of communication, and I have no trouble seeing Harvey.
Do you consider that remote viewing or more channeling?
No, it's definitely not channeling, because channeling is when you're taking your body and you're giving it to somebody else, and that person comes into your body and uses the body to speak. And then, so you become sort of, you've been kicked out while this other person is using it. So channeling I consider very unhealthy, and I don't recommend it to be done. I don't think it's good. In fact, it weakens the mind-body connection. And it's also, you're very vulnerable to exploitation. Now, if you have your car and you put the key in your car and you open the window and you leave it and you walk away, who's gonna come by? You're gonna get honest people coming by and say, "Oh my gosh, look, the window's open and the key's in the car. Should we call the police? What's going on?" Well, the person probably knows what they're doing, and we walk away. But then who's going to go in the car? Who's going to go by the car and say, "Look at that, the window's open, the keys are in the car," and they're going to jump in the car and steal it? It's going to be somebody that's a thief. So if you're opening your mind and saying you can take the body and do whatever you want with it, who's going to do that? It's going to be a bad person. And so you get really very deceptive people coming into your mind that are presenting themselves as the good guys, when in reality they're using the channel to spew all types of very exploitive information. They're doing that because they want to get a result, and they're using that to be able to give the audience a way that sort of spins information in a way that they want. So no, the conversations with Harvey are the same as the conversations that you and I are having right now. I consider them normal conversations, just telepathically mediated. Now, if you look at the stuff that came out with the Roswell stuff, basically everybody who knows anything about the Roswell stuff says the same thing, that the aliens that were captured, they didn't use English to talk to the humans. They used telepathy, and the military people had to find people who were specially capable of sort of sensing and doing that communication to work as translators. So the ET stuff is very clearly sort of psychically embedded with that type of communication. And then in addition, they don't use physical words to tell the people, okay, we're going to turn the ship to the right, so head off to the right there. Those are things that have to be mediated telepathically. And when they control the ships, the stuff that's coming out in the disclosure stuff, then the official disclosure now, is clearly motivated, is clearly oriented around the idea that the ETs that control the ships They may put their hands into like spots on the control board, but they're using their mind as their psychic stuff.
Or even the ship has been created to be part of their neural pathways.
Yes, the whole 9 yards. So yeah, when I'm there with Harvey, I see him clear as day. I can see he has clothes on. He looks very humanish, and he tells me things, and I listen to, and so on like that. The exact same way you have done the exact same thing in countless sessions, where you have gone into somebody's mind and either they consciously told you something, or you got the information your own way. That was mental to mental mind, information transfer, and that's the same as remote viewing in the sense that you're using your mind to transfer information. So what's the difference between using your mind to transfer visual information and using your mind to transfer thoughts? Well, if you do this stuff long enough, you become good at transferring thoughts, and that's what telepathy is. It's just transferring thoughts. And you and Daz, that's what you do for a living. That's what you do. So yeah, it's very easy for me to say Harvey's real. But we had to have that project, The Reality of Harvey, so that people could see that it was real. Then you had 4 remote viewers go in and describe under totally blind conditions. They did their work solo.
I need to see that project because I only saw the YouTube I haven't watched the project. I'll have to go on and look at that. Courtney, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. We need to catch up like this more often.